Good afternoon. My name is Beth Williams-Brault. I am the founder and director of the Massachusetts Healthy Youth Consortium, or the MAHYC. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The MAHYC is comprised of educators, community members, and advocates from over 200 Massachusetts districts, schools, and organizations committed to improving comprehensive sex education for K through 12 students throughout the Commonwealth. And the goal of the MAHYC is for educators, health professionals, policymakers, and other advocates to work collaboratively together towards helping to pass the Healthy Youth Act, which would ensure that comprehensive curricula are taught in public schools that choose to offer sex education. And today we have some very special guests with us. These folks are going to be talking to us about talking to youth about sex without talking about sex. Very interesting topic. We have got Courtney Brame. Courtney is the founder and the executive director and podcast host of Something Positive for Positive People. And we also have Dr. Evelin-Dacker, sex positive integrative primary care physician. So welcome, folks. Courtney, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And so to get started, I just kind of want to give a little bit of an overview of kind of where this topic came from. So I, as mentioned, host a podcast called Something Positive for Positive People. And I pretty much just interview people who are living with sexually transmitted infections about their experiences from diagnosis to disclosure. And throughout the course of these interviews, a lot of what continued to come up is that poor sex education has been something that led them down a path of having to navigate stigma in a way that aspects of sex education that don't necessarily apply to sex all the time were omitted from what they learned in their sex education. So throughout the course of my interviewing, I've learned from these people how they've gone on to learn a lot of these things that they wish that they had in their sex education. So that's kind of where the topic comes from. Evelyn, do you want to add anything to that or give any more of an introduction?
Sure. My name is Dr. Evelin-Dacker, and I'm a family practice physician in Oregon. And through all of I do integrative medicine as well as primary care, and recognizing that there is really a lack in the way that we talk about sexuality and the way that we integrate it into our whole life and our whole health. Through that, I started studying sexuality and realized one of the basic things that we're not taught is relationships, how to have relationships and what it means to be in relationships with one another. So on top of my practice of family medicine, I'm also a consent and sex educator. I was the executive director of a group in Portland, Oregon called Sex Positive Portland, where we taught a lot of these skills, including some of the skills that we will share with you.
All right, thank you. And Evelyn and I met, I heard her on a podcast, a sex education podcast with someone, and I reached out because I was very interested in what it was that she had to say, and now we're presenting together. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and begin the presentation. If you see that I'm not looking at the screen directly, it's because I'm looking up at a larger screen. All right, so here we have Sexless Sex Education. And I was playing around with the title and I thought this was really interesting and attention grabbing. It would at least make people do like the side eye kind of thing going into it. But the overall objective here is to be able to talk to youth about sex without talking about sex. Oh, I'm gonna skip ahead. There we go. So here's an overview of navigating the discussion. We'll kind of set the climate for sex ed. We'll go over just kind of where sex education starts. I'd like for this to be as interactive as people are willing for it to be. Some of the conflicting messaging, the readiness for adulting, sexual health as mental health, and sex positive, sexless sex ed. And then by the end of this, I hope that everyone is seeing stars. That's wordplay on what we'll get to towards the end. All right, so sex education, climate setting. I would like for you to, in the chat, or you can hop on and just say, what are some things that come to mind when you think of the abstinence-based sex ed? So you can just fill that in the chat, or just say something. And then the same thing for pleasure-based sex ed. So for me, when I think of abstinence sex ed, I think of the sex education that I had and how it was so hyper focused on having or the aspects of like getting sexually transmitted infection if you have sex. Alexa here wrote religion and condoms. Do we have anything that anyone would like to include for pleasure-based?
Well, I'll just I don't know why I'll chime in a little bit on abstinence-based sex ed as well from the perspective of a family physician. A lot of the things that we're taught in our sex ed is about function too. We're taught a lot about how things function and how to prevent things from going wrong. Oftentimes when we address that, we use a lot of fear and stigma tactics, such as the photos of, STIs, what they could look like, and the fact that if you get any STIs, that you're doing something wrong. When we approach sexuality from abstinence, we actually are trying to also tell people that they need to perform and act within a certain cultural standard. Abstinence-based sex ed is based in fear and in conformity, and it's in direct opposition of what I see as pleasure-based sexuality and pleasure-based sex ed. And I will hand it back to Courtney to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn, for sharing that. And with pleasure-based sex ed, I think that the word pleasure in itself has developed this attachment to go alongside sex, but what are some of the ways that we experience pleasure in our relationships, our interactions with our platonic friendships, our connection to nature, things that we just enjoy? Like for youth, that could be it's pleasure in playing video games, right? And so when I think about pleasure-based sex ed, I'm thinking about looking at the whole aspect of pleasure outside of just sex, but also with healthy and fun interactions with your peers in that way. Does anyone have any word that comes to mind when they want to fill in this blank, or does anything come to mind as far as filling in the blank for pleasure-based sex ed is? And then you can fill in the blank with your word.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in while people are thinking about it as well. I also see pleasure-based, not just sex ed, but pleasure-based anything is really as a holistic addendum to the way that we can live our life. People think of pleasure as something that is secondary or non-necessary, where I really like to also use the word joy. Because when we start leaning into joy, we can actually feel that as an opposition to sometimes the things that bring us sadness or suffering. By expanding sex education to including all the good stuff, it doesn't just mean, we're not just saying, oh, sex ed is about orgasm, but it could mean the pleasure that you get in relationship to another person, the pleasure that you get just within your body. Those are all very important elements of the change, the difference between abstinence-based sex ed and pleasure-based sex ed. So if anybody else has added anything.
Check the chat.
Nope, nothing in chat.
All right.
I'm gonna mute myself. Does anybody have any comments that they just want to unmute and say their experiences around their sexual education when they were growing up, or put it into chat?
We sit in silence too long. Y'all gonna hear me start talking a lot. um, there's space for that though. All right. Well, if at any point you want to add anything, feel free to do so. I did not mean to mute myself. Two screens. All right. Where does sex ed begin? Does it begin at home? Does it begin at school? Does it begin in community among social settings, family, or not family, but friends and classmates, like outside of the school setting? Does anyone want to just add in the chat? You can just throw it in there, what you think. And I'll say that in my personal experience, growing up, I think that the first exposure that I had, or each of these messages were completely different. I just can't remember the exact timing of which was received. In school, there was an emphasis on not getting any STIs. It was don't have sex until you're married. It was abstinence based. In my communities, my friends were having sex and no one was getting an STI. At home, I was taught about not to get anyone pregnant. So that was the emphasis there. So I'm learning three different conflicting things right around the same time. And we'll talk a little bit in more detail about that as we move forward through slides. But yeah, to see porn and media that people are having sex and they're not experiencing any of the, I'm using air quotes for anyone who's just listening in, consequences of having sex. So home life was don't get anyone pregnant. School was don't do it till you're married. And if you do, you might get an STI. And then in the community, it was like, actually, both of these places are wrong.
Mhm. For me, yeah.
Well.
Okay. For me, you know, as being brought up as with a Latina Catholic background, my home was very fear-based. And being a woman, a lot of it was like, men are machismo, stay away from men. This is the bad things that can happen to you. So a lot of it, you know, through my early home life, where I did have some sex ed at home, it was very, very fear-based and very abstinence-based. Whereas at school, again, you know, mostly about function and how to prevent pregnancies and how to prevent the transmission of infections, but all about staying away from any sexuality. My community was really quite small. I was raised pretty Catholic, so we just stayed within that, like, you have to be a virgin when you get married and all the things that meant to me. Somebody wrote in chat, and I'll just read this since you're muted, Courtney. Our sex ed teacher used to bring us packaged cookies with chocolate icing. To this day, I refer to those cookies as sex ed cookies. Yum. So at least you got some pleasure in with those cookies while you were talking about sexuality.
And just kind of adding on to what you're saying, Evelyn, too, is just that it's been avoidant in a lot of our experience. It's avoidance, sex ed. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to do it, don't have it. And there's just like a delay on when you're supposed to have it. But then, you know, we're learning in our communities and media to what it's supposed to look like, but we're not being taught the logistics. Like if you watch a movie, you see eye contact between the leading character and their love interest, and then next thing you know, they're naked in bed with each other, and then the next day comes and someone's smoking a cigarette. In a lot of mainstream movies, that's how it's seen. So yeah, it's super avoidance based. All right, I mentioned that the sex ed that I received had been very conflicting. So I'm speaking here from my personal experience in that the education system was teaching me not to have sex, or if I were to have sex, it was STD avoidant. So I'm saying STD because this was the language that was used at the time. Now we're leaning towards STI, infection instead of disease. And when I was in the house, my mother had me at a young age. She was a teen who was pregnant at 17 years old. And what was taught there for me was to prevent pregnancy. It was don't get anyone pregnant. And in that messaging, what you're told not to do can often send you into the direction of doing something else that you're not supposed to do. So this could lead to other forms of sex, like, oh, I shouldn't have that kind of sex because you'll get pregnant. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the show South Park, but they had an episode where the kids were given sex ed. They were given like purity rings or abstinence rings and told not to have sex. And at some point in the episode, kids started exploring in other ways. And you were seeing a lot of ear stuff happening if you want to use your imagination there. But just the lack of guidance in the direction that we should be headed when we're looking at how we are teaching youth to navigate their sex education, it can often do more harm than it can often do more harm in avoiding it than it can just addressing it right away. And then in the media, community, social settings, like I said, my friends were sexually active and early on just talking about how amazing sex was. And it started to create these narratives of like being a nerd for not having sex, and then creating this sense of needing to have to make it happen in order to be cool, in order to fit into my community. And again, the messaging there directly conflicted with that every time you have sex, you're going to get someone pregnant, and that every time you have sex, you're going to get sexually transmitted infection. Evelin, is there anything you want to add to the conflicting messaging?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest conflicting messages is when you're a youth and all the people who are in the know or that you look up to are telling you not to have sex, that it's so scary, and then your friends or the people you're around are telling you what's so great about it. That really leads us to getting most of our sex education as youth through each other, through other teenagers, and through pornography. I think pornography has been one of the main teachers, which is unfortunate, of sexuality, because adults are too scared to really, have been too scared to really talk about it and know how to talk about it in ways that are, really feed the whole person and are more pleasure-based.
Thank you. Moving on to the next slide. How does current sex ed influence adulthood? So here we just have 4 bullet points, and I invite everyone to add to the chat if there's anything that they see missing, or if there's any questions about more detail about what's listed here. But emotionally, behaviorally, and socially, we see under emotionally, like with self-regulation, understanding one's needs, being able to express those needs, and then vulnerability in doing so. Behaviorally, we have the inability to sometimes recognize harmful or healthy behaviors. And socially, we have the allyship is here. This may not make sense now, but it will within the next 2 slides, but being able to set boundaries and also respect those boundaries, and then be able to be aware of supportive resources. And I think that these 3 here, the emotional, behavioral, and social element, often sometimes the unawareness of, or the omission of these useful pieces of sex education that may not always have to do with sex, influence someone going into a relationship that's potentially abusive, or where consent is or could be violated, and people doing harm as abusers without even being aware that they're doing it. So we're talking here about being able to recognize pleasure and safety on the same scale or in the same way, rather than looking at it as, all right, you have to get one or the other, in the same way that I was taught sex ed. And I'm sure many other people have been, and people who I've interviewed on my podcast who have also experienced the physical symptoms of being, of missing out on the social, behavioral, and emotional aspects of what could be included in their sex education.
I also see one of the things that is influential in how sex ed is taught is that it's taught very binary, which means oftentimes sometimes we separate even the females from the males to teach them different things. And when we have a binary approach, we also have cultural constructs that go along with that, such as that if you are a person who has a vagina, then you're taught to set the boundaries around no and to push away. Whereas when, if you are raised as someone with a penis as a man, then you may have a different understanding of what consent means and what pleasure means. I think, unfortunately, when we do this separation between people that are raised as girls and boys, we don't actually recognize those places where we're all the same, where we can be the same emotionally, where we could be the same behaviorally. We also don't really talk about what it means to have boundaries and what it means to consent. I think these are newer ideas that definitely were not there when I was going through sex ed, or even when my children were going through sex ed, which wasn't that long ago. So those, I think all of that missing stuff is where it continues some cultural constructs about sexuality into adulthood.
Thank you, Evelin. Sexual health is mental health, something positive for positive people. So this concept, this statement has come from 5 years of interviewing people who have experienced an STI diagnosis and seeing how STI stigma has impacted them to the point of extreme mental health impacts has shown that there's a direct parallel between sexual health and mental health. And I argue that they are in fact the same things. And I want to go so deep into this, but for the sake of the presentation, I want to just be able to highlight how influential these key components that we're getting into are to sex education, to the point that they would have supported people at the point where prevention has let them down, or where their sex ed has let them down, so that they can navigate their life moving forward. Okay, next slide. Okay, all right. I think I'm good at this part, which is just me talking. So I'm gonna unshare the screen temporarily. All right, so everybody can see me. Okay, so I want to share my personal experience having been diagnosed with an STI myself, which led to me producing the podcast, Something Positive for Positive People. So I was diagnosed with herpes, genital herpes in 2000 and it was 9 years ago. Can't do math right now. But at that point in time, I didn't really know what resources there were available to me. And again, I felt like I was let down. I felt like I let myself down. When in the reality, I just wasn't given the tools that I needed in order to navigate an STI diagnosis. And I did what the CDC said, which was to use condoms. My sex education system taught me to avoid STIs, and the way in doing so was to just not have sex. And if all my friends around me were having sex, then and not getting STIs or not getting people pregnant, then I was missing out. So getting to the point where I was able to become sexually active and have those experiences directly challenge the education that I was receiving, it kind of created this distrust. All right, well, what else is it that, what else is wrong, if you will? Navigating that aspect of my experience having an STI, I started to come in contact with other people who also had herpes, and I started to find myself in these communities, and I began to interview these people who were living with herpes, and I got to see consistently just so many different ways that consent came into play, how the recognition of or falling victim to abusive relationships has occurred, being able to set and uphold and respect boundaries. And then I think most importantly, the ability or inability to ask for help and look out for support resources, because you typically just don't know where to go until you find yourself there. And with that being something that's so shameful, like when you do as you're told or what you were taught to do, as far as minimizing the chances of getting an STI. You don't really want to ask for help because of the stigma, because of the shame that's also in the sex education, but you're also not taught where to go for this information if things don't go the way that they're supposed to. So it was a lot of just self-education for me through speaking to other people who've had lived experiences navigating this challenge that brought up what you're going to see as we begin to move forward through the presentation as well. So I am going to now go back to sharing screen and then go, hold on, 2 screen problems, actually 3 screens. Here we go. All right. I think we are back. There we go. Okay. All right. So throughout those interviews, the interconnectedness of sexual health and mental health. So like I said, I say sexual health is mental health, but for just being not argumentative with anyone who may disagree, this is a much clearer way of just saying there's an interconnectedness of the two. I want to provide a trigger warning here that suicide is something that's mentioned, as this was a part of the survey. So a survey from Something Positive for Positive People in 2021, 1,149 people took the survey. So 1,149 people took the survey. And in this survey, it was a very lengthy survey, but there were a few statistics that stood out that are relevant to the importance of being able to teach sex ed that is inclusive to the components of sex ed that are seemingly omitted. So I want to give that little bit of a disclaimer right here and go into our statistics. All right. So of that 1,149 people who were living with herpes who took the survey, 36.2% of them experienced suicide ideation. What's shocking is that 3% of people had attempted suicide after their herpes diagnosis. And if you want to see this for yourself, you can go to www.spfpp.org/2021 survey. And it's on the website. Even if you just go to spfpp.org, you'll be able to find it. But there's also more stats that may be of interest as well from that survey. But these were ones that really stood out. And in reference to how the sexless components of sex ed play a major role in this is the fact that adults diagnosed with herpes who did not know what resources they needed until they happened to have stumbled across them on their own rather than being led to them. So that's 91% of those survey participants who did not know what resources that they needed. And this is a very reflective piece of information, because had they known ahead of time within their sex education, perhaps, that if there are things that happen that don't go as planned, here is where you can go in order to identify how to navigate those spaces moving forward. I forgot what the next slide is off the top of my head. Okay, here we go. So going back to sexual health is mental health. So some of the continued aspects of the sexless piece of sex education is the ability to recognize healthy and unhealthy behaviors, being able to manage relationships, and then just having the awareness of supportive resources as well as people and allyship. Upon a sexual health status change, it's just the stigma that keeps people from wanting to reach out for help. And this is and can be isolating and make people more prone to abusive relationships, not just necessarily physically abusive, but emotionally as well as financially. These are all aspects of different unhealthy behaviors that I believe can be mitigated by having more of an understanding in our education system. If the people who present the barriers to being able to offer comprehensive sex education that includes these components, if they were to be able to reframe and look at this like it's mental health that is going to translate into sexuality, then perhaps this can remove that barrier for us. And so, yeah, there are lessons that the sex positive communities teach us that while, yeah, you see sex positivity and you may think sex, and on the surface, what? I'm going to pass it over to you shortly too. I saw you on mute. Yeah, there are things that we can learn from sex positive communities that we can teach to youth or present them as a foundation for being able to manage their relationships pre-sex that also translate into their sexual encounters as they go into those spaces. Evelyn, were you going to speak on this slide or you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, no, I'm just going to speak a little bit about a perspective from a healthcare provider. Yeah, sexual health is mental health. It's also physical health and spiritual health. And I would say sexual health is health as well. And it's something that you would think that family physicians, doctors, healthcare providers would know about, but it really isn't true. When Courtney spoke about people getting their diagnosis and really having no resources or understanding about it, I'd have to say that most doctors do not know what to say or how to actually help our patients with disclosure and understanding of this one particular infection. And that's one reason that I actually started a little bit more of my own education on sexuality, because I really felt like we weren't doing a good service to our patients and to everybody. So what I did is I actually went into sex positive communities. This is where I got my sexuality education. I went into these sex positive communities to learn about what are we doing wrong? How are we not educating and teaching our children and our adults of how to actually be healthy in all the aspects. I've seen a lot of trauma from sexual encounters, trauma from STIs, trauma from undesired pregnancies, trauma from just not knowing how to navigate your own sexuality, as well as sexuality being used inappropriately in relationships. As an integrative provider who really wants to look at the whole person, I just didn't even know where to look. I looked in my medical books. I maybe have had a half a day of sexuality training in med school, and it's just something that is really uncomfortable for anyone to approach. It's even uncomfortable for me sometimes to talk about sexuality. So going through these sex positive communities is really where I learned all the things that we have yet to be encountered and taught in our dominant paradigm or in our just our current cultural standard.
Going back to the tab, I promise. There we go. And does anyone have questions while I navigate my two screens? All right. And share. Okay. All right, moving forward. So these are some of the things that consistently came up in the conversations that I was having or that I have with people who are in this space of having their mental health impacted by their sexual health. So being able to not just be able to say yes or no, but to be able to like mean that yes. And for people to be able to know that, hey, no is a full sentence. And not only that, but on the receiving end of a verbal no, understand nonverbal no's as well. And when we get to the point of people understanding that yes and no as a consent in a whole, consent as a whole, we also find ourselves at boundaries. Like, what are you saying yes to? What are you a yes to? And then what are you saying no to? Being able to communicate what your needs are and respect the needs of others, being able to make the requests of others that allow for you to get your needs met as well. So being able to teach kids boundaries or youth boundaries. it took me until I was 30 years. I'm 33 now, but it took me until I was 30 to even hear the word boundaries. And maybe a little bit before that, through these conversations, to understand consent isn't just someone saying yes. And then like the factors that go into one's ability to say yes, and power dynamics, and really getting an understanding of not all yeses are yeses, right? And how culture teaches, like in sales is a perfect example. No doesn't always mean no. So keep going after what you want, persistence. Me being taught as a man, a male-bodied individual, these were some of the messages that I received. And it took for me to go through this self-education way later in regards to these things that weren't necessarily exclusive to sex, to understand that. Being able to manage relationships, being able to identify abusive or unethical behavior. And that I in hindsight now have language to put into perspective that I have been in abusive relationships. And for men to have been abused or in abusive relationships, that's really not something that you're supposed to speak of according to society's culture and these things that we just universally subscribe to or have projected onto us. So even that stigma of men potentially being abused would have kept me from seeking out support. I didn't want to talk to my people about it. Like, I didn't know that that was even a thing that could happen. So identifying and being able to reach into your communities and know what language there is to use, know what support resources are available, can allow for you to more quickly utilize them and minimize any further harm that can come as a result of not having these components. And I think that these components are very crucial to sex education, given the people that I've talked to who, in an extreme case, have attempted suicide because of their HSV diagnosis, when a lot of that could have been mitigated just from them knowing, not don't get herpes or don't get an STI, but if it was, hey, you know, these are some things that happen. In the event that something happens, here's where you can go. And a lot of these people wouldn't have endured and been in abusive relationships near as long as they've had, or had their boundaries disrespected or consent violated, or been in just unethical relationships, not just with sexual partners, but also the people around them who may potentially weaponize their status against them. Evelyn, anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, just that it's really interesting that, you know, as we go in, when I went into sex positive communities, the things I learned were not really about sex at all. A lot of them were about how to navigate relationships. And I love that. I think that that is one of the key components that we are missing in our education around this.
All right, so now we get into, I feel like there should have been a slide between here. I guess not. I must have not. Okay, we're gonna get right into it. So STARS is a framework that, Evelyn.
Okay, well, when I heard about all of these things that were not discussed in sexuality, I was like, wow, we need to be able to teach this. And so I came up with this framework for the lack of a better way of describing it, a safer sex talk. And I came up with this framework to teach my patients, because I cannot tell you how many people came in to see me for STI checks that when I asked them, and these are people in their 40s and 50s, and I'm like, did you talk about your sexual health and your STI status? And they're like, no, I didn't have to, because, you know, he has only been with one person or two people. And I'm like, okay, but you have chlamydia. So I felt like we just don't really know how to talk to one another about what we need and what we desire when we engage in relationships. So I came up with this acronym that STARS, and it stands for sexual health and your STI status, what your turn-ons and desires, your avoids, which are your boundaries and any triggers or trauma that's related to that. The R is your relationship intentions and expectations. And the S is your safety protocols, which exist beyond just, you know, when we think about safety, we think about preventing STIs and undesired pregnancies. But really, safety is so much bigger. It encompasses what we need to feel safe within ourselves and within our container that we create with another person. So to start with the S, I see sexual health as whole person health. It's important for us to address it, not just as something when we have a dysfunction or where things aren't working, but to actually use sexual health as part of what brings us in our body, as part of our embodiment, and as part of seeking pleasure in our everyday life and with one another. Our turn-ons and desires really have to do with what it is that we need and how we can be the most engaged with one another. Sometimes we don't talk about this and we just assume everybody wants the same thing, but as we often learn, everybody is different and unique. Avoids, I feel, is really powerful, especially because most people are not taught boundaries, especially most adults. And when I ask children, they really aren't either. And what I mean for boundaries is that space that exists between you and me, that space that exists so that we can be in relationship. Boundaries are different than walls. Walls are something that prevents us from being in relationship with someone, but boundaries are some things that allow us to go deeper with one another. It helps us understand where our true yeses and where our nos exist. And by really deconstructing that, we're so much better able to advocate for ourselves. I often tell people, I often tell people that if you can't say no, then you can't really say yes. And you can't, so saying no is important. Our relationship intentions and expectations could also be one of those places where we just assume everybody wants the same thing and we all follow the same cultural standard. But there's so much diversity, and we're seeing diversity come up more and more. I'm sorry. We're seeing diversity come up more and more in the way people express their sexuality, in the way that people want to have relationships, in the way that people, what they need after they have sex. I mean, what does sex even mean to somebody? So when we talk about this in terms of not talking about the actual act of sex, but we talk about what it is that we want and desire with one another and what we need, actually outwardly expressing, like after I engage, what I need is X, Y, and Z. And then the safety protocols, as I've discussed before, could have to do something as wide-ranging as the use of alcohol and drugs, location. If you're at a party with someone, how do you make sure, like if you're a teenager and you're at a party and there's alcohol, how can you actually create safety around that if you also have that desire to engage sexually with other people? So every one of these can actually be addressed without ever talking about the actual act of sexuality. Anyway, do you want to add something to?
I think that puts it together. When I think about safety, I think as someone who's new to this space of like speaking to what safety is, I often think physical safety is this place physically safe for me, but there's also this emotional level of safety as well. Being able to express, all right, I've been out, I've been socializing for a while. We're seeing a lot of people in the media, social media, talking about self-care and what people need for themselves in order to recharge and get back to whatever their baseline is. Being able to say, hey, I need, and this really ties in together. I can't tell you how many times I've been out a lot later and longer than I wanted to in the past, and the night ended up going in a way that people were getting in trouble. Let's just say that. So being able to say, hey, I have a need that I'm going to go home. Like I need to be able to say I'm going home at this time. I don't want to be out past 2 a.m. because my mom used to always tell me nothing open after 2 a.m. but legs. And those types of interactions with my friends where I didn't have any boundaries would get us in a little bit of trouble. And these don't even revolve around sex. So I look at this and I can pull from my own lived experiences and be like, wow, that is absolutely right.
Yeah, I just want to also say stars are what I have come to believe are the 5 really important elements that we could all learn about ourselves, and then that we then could communicate with another person. The idea of doing this talk is not when you're just about to get intimate with somebody, but actually doing it beforehand, doing it way when you're just starting to get to know somebody, or if you're about to engage, it could be like a really short 5-minute elevator speech. But the idea is to really teach each of these points to everybody, to youth, adults, everybody, so that we're actually now being more introspective and self-aware, because that allows us to communicate everything on a much easier and even plane with one another.
Thank you, Evelyn. All right, so when we talk about talking to youth about sex and alleviating those barriers, I look at these 3 spaces: school, home, and community. There have been a lot of negatives that have come from not incorporating these elements into sex education. So where school is a safe space for youth to navigate aspects of managing relationships through their development into communicative adults, we're teaching youth about consent. We're teaching them about the safety of, or I'm sorry, not the safety, but the to be able to honor no, say yes, say no. These aspects in being taught in the school setting are probably one of the safer spaces for that to occur. And then at home, where we sometimes get this conflicting messaging, like I use my experience of home being, don't get anybody pregnant, school being, don't get anyone, don't have sex because you'll get an STI. And then going out into the community and learning all of these different ways that that messaging is invalid. Like these community and media, my friendships have invalidated the lessons that I was getting in school and at home. So to have a consistent framework in place, I believe is something that mitigates the potential for harm to be done. One particular episode of the podcast that I can recall, speaking to someone who was in an ongoing abusive relationship, she was not given tools to identify abuse or understand that her no meant no, or to be able to set and have her boundaries respected. And this ended up leading her into being the predatory behavior. This led her down the predatory route of getting the information, or not a predatory route, led her into a space where someone was able to take advantage of that. Someone who's older, who is like, oh no, that's not what sex is. And this would be a space that a person like her, who's gone through what she's gone through in her abusive relationship dynamic, this could be a place that feels a lot safer. It makes unsafe spaces feel safer when you don't have what you need in order to go into it and identify what a safe space or person is. So again, it just goes back to how harmful avoidance can be. So being able to speak to whoever it is that's in the way of being able to provide this comprehensive sex education, I believe that the impact of emphasizing those fundamental aspects of sex education that aren't necessarily about sex, like STARS, is something that can mitigate further harm from being done, whether conscious or unconsciously being done. All right, is sexless sex ed possible for now, or am I tripping? Like, is this something that can be implemented? Is this learning about the foundation of the STARS approach to youth? Is this something that you see possible? I think I messed up the next slide. Oh, okay, no, we didn't. Ooh, all right, so here's our contact information and the references.
I just want to speak about, is it possible? I have to say that in my experience, as I've been teaching STARS and teaching it to young adults and adults, often, over and over again, I get asked, why aren't we teaching STARS to our youth? Why isn't this in high schools? Why isn't it in middle schools? This information needs to be, taught everywhere. So yeah, I'm sometimes wondering, like, why is it possible? Is it possible to actually go deeper with our youth and actually use something that we don't have to say is about, it's anti-abstinence, that actually incorporates our own sovereignty and teaches people to have agency over their body by understanding consent, by understanding boundaries, by understanding that sexuality, and I like to define that sexuality is not something that I think is something you do with another person, but it's something that's within yourself. So actually changing that focus to be about oneself and teaching relationship skills is really important. But what's the obstacle? Like, I'm really curious, like, what's the obstacle with actually moving forward through some of the outside of, like, oh, we just can't teach sex because then people will be having more of it, which is not true. So I don't know. I don't think you're tripping, Courtney. I think it is possible, and I hope that we can move forward with that dream. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes Sexless Sex Ed with Courtney and Dr. Evelin Molina-Dacker. Are there any questions at all about anything before I stop sharing my screen? You can get in contact with us individually if you like. Our emails are here, Courtney@spfpp.org, EvelinMD@gmail.com. And yeah.
Courtney and Evelin, thank you so much. Your perspectives are so refreshing and interesting and true. I think it takes these topics, it takes bringing these topics to the surface and being able to think about them for everybody to say, oh, yeah, of course mental health is sexual health. And of course we can have these conversations with kids, and we do. It's just, looking at it and as Evelin said, in a holistic perspective. Thank you so much. And yeah, are there any questions or comments for Evelin and Courtney? While you're thinking or thinking of your questions or comments, I just want to drop in the chat. This is on the MAHYC homepage. This is an action alert. While we're talking about all these things, in Massachusetts, what the MAHYC is really going for is getting educators and community members involved in advocating to pass the Healthy Youth Act, which has been in the works for 10 years. And it is really astounding as to why it has not gotten passed yet. It's been passed in the Senate, but not the House of Representatives. And there's so much stigma with sex ed that it's good to have these conversations to kind of get through all of that and say, listen, this is about healthy kids turning into healthy adults with all these different aspects, So anyway, take a look at that action alert. For Massachusetts residents, you can email your state rep right away through that action alert. There's like an email that's already pre-written, or you can call them yourself, write a letter, anything to get as many representatives as we can to forward this bill. But yeah, like I said, is there any other comments that folks have or questions for Courtney and Evelin at this time?
Thank you all very much for having us. Beth, thank you for extending the invite to come and bring this here. I appreciate you, Evelin. Thank you for making time for this as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for listening. And if you want any more information about the STARS Talk, it is at maketimeforthetalk.org. And we do teach people how to be facilitators and how to bring it to your schools, and just reach out to me if anybody is interested in that. Thank you, Courtney, for putting that in. Oh, it's maketimeforthetalk.com, not org, .com. And yeah, so if you're interested in knowing more and learning how to facilitate it and knowing how to bring it to your organization, just reach out. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Evelyn and Courtney, for joining us. And I hope everybody has a safe rest of your afternoon and evening on the East Coast for us. Take care.
Bye.